so much, Sarah. And I have to say that it was exactly this audience that I had in mind when I wrote this book, Negotiating the New START Treaty. Because as I was entering into the negotiations back in 2009, I was getting a frequent question, which is, where is the next generation of nuclear negotiators or negotiators on any arms control treaty going to come from? And I learned a lot during the negotiations about where they can come from inside of the government, but we also need expertise developing on the outside, and it is here at Monterey, Middlebury's Center for Non-Proliferation Studies that this education objective is always front and center. And I know Bill Potter has made that his life's work, but I want to say thank you for this opportunity to talk about the book, and thank you to Sarah for the very, very kind introduction. So I'd really like to do three things in the talk today. I'd like to talk about the lessons I learned in the course of the negotiation. But to do that, I'm going to talk about what are actually the two negotiations that took place. The first with the Russian Federation, and the second with the U.S. Senate, regarding their advice and consent ratification of the START Treaty. So they are two quite distinct negotiations, and people often ask me, well, who was more difficult to negotiate with, the Russians or the senators? And to be honest with you, it's a toss-up. But we were successful in those endeavors, and I think that is, in the end of the day, what we have to keep in front of us as our hope and our goal in any negotiation, that we can be successful with all those who are responsible for actually bringing a treaty or agreement into implementation, because you can agree something spectacular at the negotiating table, but if it is never brought to the implementation phase and actually put into force, then it is not serving the purpose for which the negotiations took place. So those are some important lessons we've all had to learn at various times in the history of U.S. arms control policy. Important treaties like START II, for example, never entered into force. But we were lucky with the new START Treaty, and also we put a whole lot of work into making it happen. So yes, I learned that luck is a factor, and I talk about it in the book. Luck is sometimes a factor, but also, mostly, I think, it's just hard work. So let's talk about some of the key lessons that I learned. And the first is define your national security objectives and then stick to them. And this was very much front and center in the negotiations. It was so important that these interests were defined at the highest level by then President Barack Obama and then President Dmitry Medvedev when they met in London in April of 2009. It was really very early. We had not yet had a chance, I think, to come together fully as an administration. It probably sounds familiar given what's going on today, but I hadn't even been confirmed by the Senate at that point. But I knew I was going to be the negotiator if the Senate agreed to confirm me. The meeting in London was on the 1st of April, 2009, and I was confirmed by the Senate on the 4th of April, 2009. But I hadn't actually participated in the run-up to London because that's the important part of confirmation, right? You're not exactly allowed to participate in policy making as you will lead the confirmation process. So, but nevertheless, I had been consulted. My government colleagues had kept me informed of what was going to happen in London, and I was very glad because we were getting from the highest level a clear objective laid out that very much defined U.S. national security interests. The presidents issued a statement in London that laid out three key goals. First of all, we were to negotiate a treaty to replace the START Treaty, and we had to do it fast. And this was unheard of, but START was going out first. The first Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty was going out of force in December of 2009. So from April to December, we had 8 short months to get this treaty done. And this was like mission impossible because the START Treaty had taken 6 years on and off to negotiate. But nobody was paying too much attention to that fact. And so that was a good thing because, frankly, it lit a fire under both of the delegations. The Russians are famous at slow-rolling negotiations when they don't really want to make progress. And to be honest with you, the United States has been on the slow roll from time to time as well. So it's a well-known negotiating tactic. But the fact that the presidents told us we needed to get this done by December of 2009 was a driver, and an equal driver on both sides of the negotiating table. So that was the first important point. The second important thing was that we were to seek reductions below the level that were in the START Treaty, the central limits of the START Treaty. Now that may sound like a no-brainer if you're engaged in strategic arms reduction talks, but it is a matter for debate right now whether the United States can indeed go lower, especially in the face of these developments in China, which we don't yet know exactly what they mean, but nevertheless, there is debate about whether we can indeed continue to reduce and eliminate our nuclear weapons. So perhaps we can discuss that further during our Q&A period, but it was important at the time the New START Treaty was negotiated that it was clear we were to seek reductions below the level of the START Treaty. And the third and critical point was the presidents agreed that these negotiations would be about strategic offensive forces. They would not touch on limiting missile defenses. And time again, my Russian counterpart tried to slip that in to say we must limit strategic defenses in this treaty as well. And I was able always to point to the agreement between Obama and Medvedev in London that the negotiation should be about reducing strategic offensive forces. And so that was the third important aspect. But you see, that is why I say it's so important to have clear marching orders, and if possible to get them from the highest level, because in that way you have your national security objectives defined for both sides at the outset, and that was very important for the New START Treaty. Now let's talk a little bit about the other important aspect of my lessons learned. There are several. They appear in the last chapter of the book, but the one I wanted to talk about was knowing your counterpart, knowing your opposite of the negotiating table. I was really lucky in that I had just spent 3 years living in Moscow as the director of the Carnegie Moscow Center. So my counterpart, Anatoly Antonov, who is currently the Russian ambassador to the United States, I know he's been a visitor here to Monterey, at least virtually in the last year and a half. But we had come to know each other in Moscow. He had come and spoken at my invitation at the Carnegie Moscow Center. And we had a kind of, I would say, collegial relationship, professional relationship, which was good because we avoided the getting to know you, what I call it is the getting to know you kahoots of negotiators as they begin a new negotiation. We worked together. I had respect for his professional knowledge of these issues, and well, he knew me as an academic, the director of the Carnegie Moscow Center, but he also knew that I knew a lot about strategic nuclear weapons and arms control matters. So I think that was very, very important. The other thing I wanted to stress, because I know it's part of how you think about the importance of language here at Monterey and the Monterey Institute. It was very important to me that I knew Russian, and that, but not only the fact that I knew Russian, but that there were several on my delegation who also spoke Russian very, very well, in addition, of course, to our very professional and well-trained interpreters, whose business it was to know the language. But in the case of the regular work of the delegation, it's so important, I think, for us to know at least some native speakers or speakers who have learned the language to be there at the table, because it allows you essentially to listen twice. During a negotiation, you have an interpreter sitting by your side, my chief interpreter always at my right hand, and there's consecutive interpretation. So you see, if you can listen twice, both in the original Russian and then to the interpretation, you have a chance to understand a lot more quickly. And you can understand the nuance from the Russian as well. So that's why I always said that it was very important for us to have Russian speakers on our delegation. Certainly the Russians had very many excellent English speakers on their side of the table. And if we don't have Russian speakers on our side, then they have an advantage. But I think this was a factor in speeding up the negotiations. And as time went by, Anatoly and I began to meet in what we call the heads of delegation meetings, the so-called pods meetings. It sounds like something you might buy in a hardware store, but they were meetings where we would basically break through problems that had been experienced at the technical level in our various working groups. We had about half a dozen working groups devoted to working the details of the verification regime, how we were going to conduct conversions or eliminations under the treaty, how we were going to exchange notifications, technical issues of this kind. And once our technical leads came up against a problem that they could not figure out how to solve, they would send it up to Anatoly and me in these so-called pods meetings. And the fact that he and I would speak a kind of mishmash of Russian and English together, technical issues, going over, problems and issues that we were trying to settle with our capitals, that had this very free-flowing language in Russian and in English, I think really sped things up. And I needed, and he needed, to have good note takers with us. You never want to be in a meeting like that, where you're trying to solve important problems with political implications in the capital. You never want to be in a meeting like that without a note taker. But luckily, I had very good Russian speakers on my delegation. I always took a note taker with me, and he, of course, had the English speakers, so he always had a note taker with him as well. So that is the importance of language and being able to speak each other's language. And I think that holds true also for other languages. That's why I would urge the United States is at a disadvantage if we don't have people on our delegations who are very good at speaking the languages on the other side of the table. Languages, if it's a multi-level negotiation, of course. Now, I want to say one other thing. There's so many aspects of the negotiations we can talk about. I'm happy to get into even technical details regarding the verification regime and so forth. But I did want to just say that I think it's really important not to engage in what I call drive-by negotiations. I frankly am a little concerned that where we are heading with these strategic stability talks that are now launched between Russia and the United States, we might be in danger of falling into a pattern of drive-by negotiations where we get together once every 3 months perhaps, spend a day or two in Geneva, and go away, and don't really engage deeply. Because the way you make progress is to get working groups together with technical expertise on both sides. And here's a case where the technical experts speak each other's technical language. The guys who were weapons system operators on my delegation from the Air Force or the Navy, they didn't know Russian, but they knew about ballistic missiles and how submarines operate and how a bomber operates. And their Russian counterparts, it was the same. They spoke the same technical language. And again, working together with interpreters, they could really come to at least mutual understanding very, very quickly. They might not solve the problem. That's when we heads of delegations had to solve the problem sometimes, but they could come to very quick understanding because they spoke the same technical language. You cannot do that if you're coming and having big plenary meetings in Geneva once every 3 months. You need to get the technical people together. So I was actually glad that last Thursday on the 30th, they announced the formation of 2 working groups, one to tackle the future of the arms control agenda and a follow-on to the New START treaty, and the other to tackle in a more open-ended way the advent of emerging and disruptive technologies and what the implications would be for what the Russians are calling an equitable security equation. I'm still not sure what that means, but maybe they'll figure it out. But I welcome the fact that they are going to be talking about new technologies, and getting technical people together to do that is the right thing. So let's move over now and talk for just a minute about advice and consent in the Senate. People say the Senate ratifies oftentimes. The Senate doesn't ratify. It is the President who ratifies the treaty. It's his signature that makes it the law of the land. But the Senate gives its advice and consent to ratification, which is an important, a vital, in fact, constitutional duty of the Senate. So I get asked a lot, can we ever ratify another treaty? And my answer is, I hope so, because it's not just about arms control treaties. We're talking about trade and economic treaties. We're talking about military and defense treaties. We're talking about sometimes quite mundane things like boundaries agreements that take a long time to agree, or fisheries treaties that divide up fish stocks, environmental types of issues also. So the United States must be able to ratify treaties, or we will simply have to set aside this instrument of international law. I would hate to see us do that because treaties tend to have a certain survivability over time that political agreements do not. Political agreements have their role and their importance as well, but the treaty instrument, as the highest law of the land, does tend to have more survivability than some of these other instruments. So I think it's very important. Now, how did we get it to happen in the case of New START, which was incredibly also controversial? My answer to that is a two-part answer. One is that the senators need to be allowed to vote their conscience. And in the case of New START, the senators were allowed to vote their conscience. And that was a baseline requirement. Nowadays, with so much so much importance being placed on the party line vote, these demands being placed on senators to vote along party lines. If that is going to be the case from now on out, it is going to be more difficult. But I actually hope that in cases when there's a clear national security purpose for the treaty, a clear national security interest, that senators will be allowed to decide for themselves. Here, we have to be satisfying national security objectives that have been clearly stated by both parties. And in the case of the follow-on to New START, I can see such a shared objective across the aisle, both Democrats and Republicans, in our long-standing wish to get reductions and constraints on Russia's so-called non-strategic nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, sometimes it's more precise to say non-strategic nuclear weapons. So that's a bipartisan objective. So I think if this administration comes up to the Hill with a good agreement that reduces and limits Russian non-strategic nuclear weapons and does so with a good verification regime, an effective verification regime, I think we could see bipartisan support for a new arms control treaty. The other factor I think that was so important was ensuring we had information flowing in two directions. First, to the senators themselves. Any time they needed information about the New START treaty, we were ready to provide it. We did over 20 hearings and briefings, officially, but countless informal hearings and briefings. Information opportunities for the senators. In fact, I joke that you guys do it all the time, but anytime I run into a female senator in the ladies' room, I'd say, "Ma'am, do you have any questions about the New START treaty?" Washing our hands and putting on our lipstick. And, that works. They knew that we were always available. In fact, the last month before the treaty was before the Senate court's vote, we spent full time on Capitol Hill, sometimes until 10 or 11 at night. Again, speaking to senators, speaking to their staffs, providing them information. We answered over 1,000 questions for the record. So that's very important, having information flow, because my view is if senators have all their questions answered, and they understand that the treaty is indeed fulfilling vital national security objectives for the United States, they will vote in favor of it. And we got the Republican senators we needed, 72 votes in favor of the New START treaty. We need 67, so we did pretty well. But the information flow has to go in another direction, and that is out to the public. Because you need to get the public writing into their senators and saying, we want to see you vote for this treaty. It's an important role for the United States to have this treaty enforced. And this is no mean feat, because if you've been studying these issues for some time of nuclear weapons policy, you realize that it's off the public radar screen. It's on the back burner for many individuals. They don't think about it very much. But to go out and talk all over the country on news shows of all kinds, and to go to places like Des Moines, Iowa, because I wanted to get the ed board, the editorial board of the Des Moines Register, to write basically a leader saying this is a good treaty and you should be prepared to ratify it, to give advice and consent to the Senate. This was going to be important because the Des Moines Register is the kind of central node in a whole network of newspapers in the West and in the Midwest. So if we could get them to endorse the treaty, it was going to get the word out to a lot of audiences. So we worked really hard. Our partnership with the religious organizations was enormously important, from the Catholics to the evangelicals. Believe it or not, there's a certain group inside the evangelical faith who were very, very supportive of the New START Treaty, and we were able to get the word out a lot through the Sunday pulpits. Indeed, one senator voted in favor of the New START Treaty because his Methodist minister told him it was the right thing to do. So it was important to get the religious groups involved too. So that's just two examples, working with the local and regional press, but also working through the religious organizations. The book recounts a number of ways we went about developing support for the treaty. Perhaps I'm going to wrap up now, but I'm going to end with a vignette because I thought it was so, I still laugh about this. Because I did go on Sunday television, I've been on a lot of different shows, and C-SPAN has a Sunday call-in show. And I thought, great, this would be a good way to get a lot of people, around the country involved, interested, answering questions, etc. So I go on, and a guy calls in from Virginia, and he says, I'm really concerned about my Second Amendment rights. This treaty is about arms control. Is it going to do anything to constrain my Second Amendment rights? And I was really excited to say, well, sir, if you have an ICBM in your backyard. But instead I just said, oh, no, sir, it's all about nuclear weapons. Nothing about your Second Amendment rights. So that was one funny example of a number of funny examples all laid out in the book. So I do endorse it. Of course I endorse it because it's my book, but I thank you for your attention and look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rose. I'm going to shout because I think it's just us in here. I'd love to open the floor to any questions. I have many that I could ask to get us started, but I see we've got a taker right here in our second row. So can I ask you to introduce yourself, maybe say where you're from, and then pose your question to Rose?
I'm Vasil Tuganov. I'm from Russia, Federation, and I'm a bright student here, first year in BTS program. And I listened to your podcast with Andrei Kaplitsky and Alexei Kirov that you've done back in night. Right when your book was published, right? And there you talk about compartmentalism, about the importance of compartmentalism in arms control talks. Could you please elaborate a little bit more about it, because it was so short in the podcast I didn't quite grasp the importance of it, and maybe elaborate more on that.
Right, no, it's a great question, and it is related to the notion of tightly defining national security objectives. But it also, I think, makes sense in any negotiation to ensure that you have an objective that's achievable. And sometimes people are tempted to throw all kinds of issues into a negotiating basket and try to get a kind of grand bargain, a kind of grand deal. My experience is that it doesn't work across arenas. So, for example, the notion of combining, I would argue, a deal that is to reduce and eliminate strategic offensive forces was a deal that would somehow address missile defenses. To me, that's too much to bite off in a single negotiation. You do much better if you focus your efforts in order to achieve a very defined objective. Compartmentalism also, though, at the time, we were just beginning to see how the Biden administration was going to address the issue of our bilateral relationship, which is in a very negative state, but trying to make them more positive progress on nuclear policy issues, nuclear arms control, and non-proliferation related issues, because nuclear weapons are an existential threat, not only in the United States and Russia, but on a global basis. So So the notion that you can compartmentalize also and continue to work on issues that are of such clear national security interests, not only to our two countries, but again on an international basis, security objectives that everyone wants to see achieved. So that's another aspect of compartmentalization. That yes, we have a terrible bilateral relationship. I'm sad about it, but that's where we are today. But nevertheless, at the same time, we can make progress in certain areas that are of vital interest to us both.
Thank you.
Alice.
Hi, my name is Hollis. I'm originally from Wisconsin. Thanks for coming to speak with us today. So you mentioned how you were able to sort of skirt the issue of missile defenses because of the priorities laid out by the two presidents. But I was wondering, with new developments in missile technology and new advances in other countries' missile programs, do you think it will still be possible to sort of skirt this issue, or do you see it becoming more of a roadblock in like future negotiations between Russia and the US?
I don't think it needs to be a roadblock at all. And I know that it will get brought up. If you read the Russian press, interviews that the Foreign Minister Berkov gave, and it's very clear that the Russians are going to bring up the issue of missile defense. My view is that this is an issue that is ripe for discussion in a bilateral way, however. The Russians have tended simply to say, we're concerned about your missile defenses to the United States. We want to see limits on your missile defenses to the United States. We're worried that you might have a very perfect missile defense system that will undermine our strategic offensive deterrent. Well, I think now is the time, given the very extensive developments on the Russian side in terms of missile defense technology, that it's time for the United States to say, we're concerned about your missile defenses. We're concerned that you might be gaining some capability with the new S-500 system, for example, that could, in the future, undermine U.S. strategic offensive forces. So it's becoming, as I would say, more of a mutual concern now. And to me, that is a recipe for gaining more success now. I don't know if politically the United States will ever agree to limit missile defenses. We got out of the ABM treaty because it was a major issue for a number of actors in our political system, particularly on the Republican side of the aisle, but they just didn't want to limit missile defenses. But I think there are ways that we can talk to the Russians about understanding what each other is doing in this space, developing some mutual predictability, some mutual confidence. That does mean, I think, the kinds of transparency and predictability measures that the United States has long been talking about with the Russian Federation regarding missile defenses. So we'll see what happens at the negotiating table. I do understand in the SSD talks in Geneva last week that this issue was raised in the United States, expressed its interest in also understanding more about what the Russians are doing in modernizing missile defense technology on the Russian side. So that's a good start from my perspective.
Once again, and it's Anna from Ukraine, and I have two small questions. First is also in continuation of this topic, that aside from defensive missile technologies that are developed in Russia, there is another side of this coin of offensive missile technologies that they are developing. How do you see to which extent they are or can be covered by the new upcoming START? And maybe some additional agreements should be made in regard of some of them. And another part of the question is on more long-term perspective about the involving of other countries, the concerns of Trump involving China to some extent. And also in reference, I've read one of the articles suggesting to change the technology from percentages of reduction to the caps. And in this sense, try to involve China through putting the caps, like, we will not have more than this number of. Well, maybe will that help? What is your opinion on that?
Okay. Many good questions there. I think that the United States really has two top-line goals in this negotiation to replace the new START treaty. One I've already referred to, that is getting constraints on Russian non-strategic nuclear weapons. But the second is getting constraints on these so-called exotic delivery vehicles that the Russian Federation has rolled out, most famously in speech by President Putin in March of 2018. Now, two of these systems, the so-called exotic systems, are already constrained by the New START Treaty, the Sarmat, the heavy ICBM. It's not so exotic, that's actually good. It's giving us a little bit concerned about it. Follow on to the SS-18. The other system is their avant-garde hypersonic glide vehicle. It is also constrained by the New START Treaty and has already been exhibited by the Russian Federation to the U.S. side as part of the process of bringing it under the New START limits. So Sarmat and the avant-garde already limited by the New START Treaty. The other systems, the two nuclear-propelled systems, plus the air-launched ballistic missile, the Kinjal, I think, will be a topic for discussion during the negotiations. I know that's the intention of the United States to limit those systems in the next negotiation, but then the question is, what's the United States going to take? The Russians aren't going to give up on the systems unless they can get something for it. Now, people have been concerned about the Russians demanding limits on missile defenses. Again, because of the political issues in the United States, I have urged Russian colleagues not to go in that direction. Let's think about what else the Russian side may like to see some constraints on. It's not up to me to define that for the Russian side, but anyway, I've asked that they think about the political issues of trying to limit missile defenses, missile defense interceptors, and advising that they should think of something else that they'd like to ask for. Again, it's not to me to suggest, but I think those will be the main goals of the United States, and it will be interesting to see how it goes. By the way, though, I do think that it's high time, and this brings in the China part of the question, that we look for areas where we can get to the table quickly with China to discuss beginning to place some constraints on their systems. And I think hypersonics is one area. We need to look for areas where the Chinese have some quality and capability. And hypersonics is one area, not only glide vehicles, but other hypersonic missile systems. And here we might, I think, engage fruitful discussion, not only with the Chinese, but also with the Russians. People ask me frequently, well, is it going to be a trilateral negotiation? I don't know. I think it would be interesting to try, but honestly, it would be, it would be complex. We and the Russians have a long-range relationship at the negotiating table, starting with the first strategic arms limitation negotiations in the early 1970s. 50 years we've been negotiating and talking together about these topics, and we have, I would say, a certain shared knowledge that helps us get through issues quickly and get to yes quickly. We don't agree quickly, but we do have a shared knowledge and understanding. The Chinese will want to be starting from scratch, so it's a little complicated to try to think of. I guess it could be educational when you think about it, to have the United States and Russia trying to negotiate together with the Chinese on these issues. It would be perhaps helpful to them to see how we do get through issues at the negotiating table, but I'm tending to think myself, maybe we need to involve the Chinese in bilateral, parallel talks to what we would be doing with the Russians. But we'll see where that goes. But I absolutely agree that it is vital to get the Chinese to the negotiating table sooner rather than later. At the same time, I think it's vital to engage them in strategic stability dialogue. We need to understand what the heck they're up to with those 200 plus missile sites that we built in northwest China. And again, I congratulate the work that's done here. Jeff Lewis, I don't know if you're on the phone, but I congratulate those who were involved in the work here at Monterey that broke the news of one of these issues. So, but we need to understand, what are they up to? What is this for? People say, oh, it's a shell game. That's exactly what the Soviets did in the 60s, in the 50s and 60s, because they didn't actually have enough missiles yet. So maybe they're repeating that experience. Or maybe they are going for some kind of parity relationship, a sprint parity, as we've long been concerned about. So we'll see. But we need to talk to them and try to find out what they're.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a couple of questions that are subsumed under probably the category of bureaucratic politics. And I remember reading an early book on the arms control bylaws and negotiations by John Newhouse going on, in which there is a reference to the fact that it was easier to negotiate with Moscow than it was to negotiate a position internally. And I think, that has been referenced in subsequent negotiations as well. So one question, a multi-part question here under the rubric of bureaucratic politics, to what extent was that a phenomenon of New START negotiations? My second related question has to do with the leeway that you and Ambassador Antonov have in terms of staking out positions, given the fact that we both had backstopping groups in Washington and Moscow, and at least to some extent you were kind of on a leash with respect to what you could do. So maybe if you could say a little bit more about that. My last related question here is and sort of a follow-up to the prior question, is the extent to which you and Ambassador Antonov were able to collaborate in some fashion in getting the capitals on board for positions that you might have been able to work out in your bilaterals. I mean, there are examples of this in prior negotiations where through some degree of subterfuge or at least, I don't know exactly what the word would be in Russian, but there was a process by which you knew what you wanted, you thought there was a path forward, and the trick was how do you get both sides to so if you could address those questions as much detail as you care, that would be great. And thanks so much for joining us here. It's really a pleasure to hear you and to promote your book. So you didn't bring a lot of copies of the book, but I'm sure Ms. Gottemoeller would be delighted at some point in the future to autograph copies if you purchase the book. Rose, please.
Thank you, Bill. I certainly would be glad to do so. In fact, I just autographed this one for Sammy here. I didn't bring my own copy, so I was grateful to have it on this today. So three questions. They're interrelated. They're very important. First of all, I go back to my earlier remark about the London meeting and the fact that the United States and Russia were resolved to replace the START treaty before it went out of force in December of 2009. That agreement between the two sides, it was a strong consensus. And it actually drove U.S. policymaking in a positive direction because we did not have snipers in various parts of the interagency shooting at us as we were trying to move forward. Now, it wasn't always easy dealing with the joint staff or dealing with OSD or dealing with the intelligence organizations. In particular, there were some who felt rather strongly that we should hold on to more aspects of the START verification regime than we did. And I talk about that in the book. I'll be glad to describe in more detail the streamlining process that we went through. But there were interagency disagreements. It wasn't smooth sailing the whole way. But the big strategic objective was well agreed in the U.S. interagency. So from that perspective, what we suffered from most, and this gets to my answer to the second and third question, what we suffered from most was a lack of what my then boss, Ellen Tauscher, who was Undersecretary for Control of International Security at the time, she sadly left us and she died a couple of years ago. But she said there's no muscle memory in Washington anymore on how to do a strategic arms treaty. Don't forget that START was negotiated in 1990, 1991, back into the 80s, finally entered into force in 1994. Those are eons in bureaucratic time. So there really wasn't a whole lot of memory inside the administration from the highest level, from the president down into the bureaucracies about how to accomplish different goals in the Monterey Treaty. And frankly, that's what got me into trouble the most, including with President Obama himself. Because Monterey and I did strive together, as negotiators would do, having, quiet coffee, we do meet sometimes one-on-one, having a quiet coffee to try out some ideas, jotting down ideas on a napkin. This is all time-honored methods. If you ever see that play about the walk in the woods, you can see some of these techniques that go on in formal discussions one-on-one. So we came up with what I thought was a really brilliant idea, a side letter. Side letters have been used throughout the history of arms control treaties to express a view of one side or the other, but not to put it in a legally binding treaty language that would constrain the other side. So we came up with the idea of expressing in a single letter the U.S. position on missile defense and the Russian position on missile defense, and essentially laying out our two issues, but not in any way, again, constraining missile defense. And I sent this back to Washington. It was during Snowmageddon. We had a 3-foot snowfall in 2010 in February. It shut down the government for a week. I wasn't getting any instructions, believe it or not. So I said, well, we've got to try out some ideas here. We have to fix this issue. It's turning into one of the endgame issues. So I came up with this idea of a letter expressing our views on this and sent it back to Washington. Somehow, it ended up in the president's inbox. It's one of those things that should have gone into the bowels of the bureaucracy for consideration, and then we eventually would get some instructions. I hope that was the idea. And I thought this is a no-brainer that, I forget that you might remember, Bill, the number of start letters, side letters to the start treaty, there's about a dozen of them, I think. So this is a no-brainer. The president was furious. And before I knew it, again, I had National Security Advisor, Deputy National Security Advisor Tom Donald on the phone, yelling at me for freelancing, as he put it in an unhelpful way. And I thought, But anyway, we did have a secret weapon in Washington, and that's a man named James Timby, who was the special advisor to the T Undersecretary. He is experienced, knows negotiations inside and out. He succeeded in pulling everybody down, getting them to relax, and he came back with an alternative, which was a better idea, 2 separate letters. One by the U.S. expressing our view on missile defense, one by the Russians expressing their view on missile defense. 2 separate letters, the president bought off on it, we were home free. But it just goes to show that's the problem that I had, Bill. It wasn't like sniping and shooting as from the interagency per se. To my mind, it was the lack of experience and knowledge about all the parts and pieces that can make for a good strategic arms treaty. And that's, again, the value of education and doing the kind of simulations that you do here at Monterey is that you form some of that knowledge and understanding, I think, for future negotiations.
There's a question back here, and then I just want to say who I'm going to take. John, I know you had one, and then I believe that there was one over here as well, so we'll take you three. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, Captain Roy Haylander with the U.S. Air Force. I'm a student at the Naval Postgraduate School. I'm just wondering, and as you're aware, we have removed ourselves from several treaties with Russia over the last few years, the INF Treaty as well as the Open Skies Treaty. Do you expect that to kind of remain a lingering cloud and hindering any future negotiations with Russians on any arms control? Or will they be able to successfully compartmentalize it and continue to start?
Well, they constantly remind us of how I said that treaties are the highest law of man and that they are harder to get out of. They are harder to get out of than just tearing up the JCPOA or something like that. Do it if they're wrong. But I will say that in the case of the INF Treaty, the violation on the Russian side was clear, so it was in many ways for compliance reasons justified. Myself, I would have tried to work harder at the diplomacy to try to retain the INF Treaty, but that was not the decision that was made by the previous administration. So we are where we are, but I think it was entirely justified to use the INF Treaty. The biggest question in my mind now is how do we replace that treaty was renewed constraints on intermediate range ground-launched missiles in Europe and in Asia. Because here's another area where there's some equality of capability on the Chinese side, and we need to get them to the table to talk about intermediate range ground-launched missiles. So I think that's where I'm turning my attention and energy now, and I don't need to start thinking about that, whether we can make any sense of this offer the Russians have made to take the 9M729, the missile that violates the INF Treaty, out of Europe and move it east of the Urals with monitoring and verification. That will be very important. But I think it's actually a good idea because it will get the Chinese to sit up and take more notice of sending a bunch of Russian missiles or appearing east of the Urals. That might also help to bring them to the negotiating table. So I do think that we should be looking for ways to replace the INF Treaty. With Open Skies, I really mourn the loss of that treaty, not because it was so great at providing imagery, but it was really important for military confidence building, and we have very, very few tools these days for military confidence building. So I really do mourn the loss of that treaty. There was no support for it in the Department of Defense, however, and that's, I think, the problem that we run into. So I think we need to renew military confidence building, but it won't be by a return to an Open Skies type arrangement. I've been thinking maybe we can come to something that has wider ranging objectives, like joint environmental monitoring or something like that. That would bring in other actors, other organizations, but we'll have a long way to go because the United States will need to replace its Open Skies platforms with platforms that will be capable of doing a wider array of imaging missions. So.
John, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Rose, for a fantastic talk, and congratulations on the book. I want to take you slightly away from the New Start Treaty, and the context is late 2009, I guess, we started to push this issue in the Senate. I had a conversation with a senior national security official. I was at the CTBTO at the time, which, by the way, you inspired me to join. And the question was, where does the CTBT fit into the administration's priority list, especially after the Prague speech? Now, putting the CTBT aside, I was told then by this very senior official that there are much bigger fish to fry, and he shared with me the list. I don't think the CTBT featured on the top 10 of the list. Again, not addressing the CTBT at the moment. What, in your view at the moment, would be, say, the top 3 biggest fish to fry for the United States on non-proliferation?
I'll tell you why I think they should be.
Yeah.
The first is finding a replacement for the New Start Treaty, because this is going to be a very challenging negotiation. It's one of the reasons I'm so concerned about this, what I'm seeing as a kind of desultory case developed on the SSD and the working groups. It is going to be really difficult to develop a monitoring and verification regime for a treaty that constrains directly warheads. And so that's going to take a lot of technical work. We need to get at it. We need to get down to it immediately, if not sooner, with the Russians, and start talking about what is going to be possible conceptually, how we want to directly limit warheads. If that indeed is going to be our top objective, as I understand it is, to constrain Russian non-strategic nuclear weapons. So we need to get going on that. The second, that I think is extraordinarily important is, and my remarks are a little heavy on the arms control side because I tend to work there more than on non-pro, but I will come to that as the third of my top 3. The second is, again, to get going on a replacement for the INF treaty. And I don't mean trying to return to some identical treaty, but I'm thinking about having some perhaps regional arrangements that could eventually draw other regional proliferators, I shouldn't say. I suppose I shouldn't call them proliferators, they have their own national security reasons, but for example, drawing the Indians and Pakistanis in the discussion of missile restraint in South Asia. So I see also, if we get back to some reasonable approach to constraints on intermediate range systems, and we can draw perhaps others to the table. And we can also, this is a big objective, I think we need to have, we need to start disentangling nuclear and conventional dual capability systems. If we work to negotiation right with regard to both INF range systems and HGVs, we could begin to distinguish and disentangle nuclear from conventional systems. For example, talking about INF systems, I would propose range, or a ban rather, on nuclear-armed INF systems. Nuclear-armed, which we are capable now of distinguishing nuclear from conventional. We can do that monitoring tasks. And I would propose ban on nuclear-armed strategic range hypersonic vehicles, whether glide vehicles or planes, in order to begin again the process of disentangling nuclear from conventional and establish that principle. Now, those of you who are savvy will smile and say, well, that makes a lot of sense because the United States is only creating conventional systems in those ranges, and you would be right. But maybe there are other ways we could think about it, just to put in place some limits on the systems, and again, take on the difficult verification regime that would come with having perhaps a limit on nuclear-armed INF systems or strategic range HGVs. Okay, so that's number 2. Actually, it's kind of 2 plus because I put the HGVs in there too, but that objective of disentanglement is important, I think. And number 3 is related to AUKUS. And this really has disturbed me quite a bit that the United States is going sky high. It's 60-plus year commitment to minimizing the use of highly enriched uranium. And so I would like to see attention to how we figure out low enriched uranium proposal for not only for our submarines, but others going forward. And I have no objection to providing long-range nuclear submarines to the Australians. I just think that they need to be fueled by low-enriched uranium fuel, not HEU. So that's a non-proliferation objective I would like to set. And quite a bit of hot water with the White House for pushing that issue now. But on the other hand, I have a 2-part concern about this. One is with my former NATO VSG background, because it has driven such a wedge between our ally France and the United States at a critical moment. And then the other is the proliferation concerns associated with HE propulsion systems for this
Please.
Yes, if I may. Good afternoon. My name is Gottemoeller from Ukraine. I would like to come back to the talks which you had on missiles and its playing games, and call to your experience as one of the best negotiators with Russia, and to experience of your deputy director general of NATO. We have Crimea, which is de facto occupied by Russia, and we have facts that Russians are developing Crimea into a fortress, putting a lot of forces there. There are some reasons for that, but there are also some information that they are starting already recover the old Soviet nuclear facilities and planning to have their kind of ballistic missiles up to 6 with nuclear warheads. Why do we need this? I mean, why do we need such missiles in Crimea? To frighten some neighbors which are already frightened with them by itself, or it's a game they are playing with the US or some other country?
Well, so it's a question to ask the Russians, not me.
But what do you think about it?
I think it's consistent with what they have done in militarizing Kaliningrad. I see that Kaliningrad militarization and the forward deployment of very effective missiles there very much in the same context as I see the militarization process going on, which I deeply regret, and I tell Russian officials and non-officials based on every chance I get. It's illegal and improper in so many ways. But the idea is, and they've been able to show off in recent years, especially in the conflict in Syria, the civil war in Syria, they've been able to show off incredibly effective missile systems. And so it's an instrument by deploying them forward. The Islander family of missiles, for example, by deploying them forward in both Kaliningrad and now in Crimea, they are basically conveying to the NATO allies that they have all of NATO territory down to the southernmost portion of Portugal in sights. They have them in sights of Russian missiles. And so this is a message that is very strongly felt at the NATO headquarters in Brussels, and it has led, I think, to some very good and judicious steps to enhance integrated air missile defense, to enhance our training against missile threats, to enhance resilience, and also to think about whether we need to deploy some additional missile systems. NATO needs to deploy some additional missile systems. So there has been, as you know, a program to develop a conventional ground launch cruise missile in intermediate range to deploy it in Europe as well as in Asia. And I don't know where that program will go, but I think it's good to have it out there to convey clearly to the Russians that we are concerned about what they are doing with militarization in these pockets of territory that are so clearly thrust forward into NATO territory. And boy, it's been very clear working with our allies who are liberal states, Ukraine, of the Black Sea, Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey. They're very, very concerned about these developments. So, yeah. It's a very, very difficult situation. Thanks for raising that question.
I'd like to abuse my privileges as the moderator to ask you a question, Rose, perhaps while others think, because I think we have about 15 more minutes, probably maybe a little bit more. We've been talking a lot about arms control, obviously, because of the topic of your book, but a big focus, as you well know, in NCT and this past review cycle has been on risk reduction. And I wondered if you could tell us, similar to sort of John's question and framing, what would your top priorities be for risk reduction today? Where do you think that attention should be focused if progress is possible?
Yes, I've already mentioned one of them, and that is military to military consultations for risk reduction and incident response. And there's been some of that that's been going on. We just had General Milley meet with Gottemoeller last week in Helsinki. But this is at the highest level. It's important to start at the highest level of question, but to have more routinization in military staff talks, especially again since we've lost the open standard treaty, we don't have military confidence building take place in other settings, I think would be very, very important. I find it ironic. I'm glad that NATO currently has military staff talks with the Chinese that have been going on for a number of years. But it's great, it's important, it's an important mutual confidence building mechanism at the moment. Because military to military confidence building and incident response is considered business as usual to the NATO alliance. We don't do military to military staff talks in NATO. I think it's a mistake. I couldn't say this when I was NATO Deputy Secretary General, but we need to get back to talking seriously military to military about incident response and how we would handle incidents to prevent them from escalating into crisis and perhaps even into conflict. So that's the first objective. The second is trickier, and frankly, I'd be interested if anybody in the room wants to comment on this, but I'm very, very concerned the way the potential for scientist to scientist and laboratory to laboratory cooperation has been so seriously constrained in recent times. I'm sure you're aware of the declaration, the decree of the FSB last week that is saying that now bilateral or any kinds of contacts with foreigners by a Russian citizen, if they're talking about defense and security topics, could end up getting them in jail. So this is very, very concerning, and it really dampens the hopes that I had that we could get into some more laboratory discussions, for example, to talk about how we go about monitoring and verifying constraints on warheads, direct limits on warheads, or how we might think about doing some future cooperative work on a global basis in order to bring about nuclear risk reduction or radiological risk reduction. So I think there are reasons why the Russian Federation should be interested in scientist-to-scientist and laboratory exchanges, but at the moment they are, I think, it's fair to say they're just not possible. I was going to say sharply constrained, but I think it's worse than sharply constrained. I think they're just not possible. But I would hope that that is something that can be a product of the talks between our two countries. The third area, and this is an area that I don't know as much about as I wish I knew, but we are approaching the review conference for the Biological Weapons Convention, and there's so much concern about the evolution of biotechnology now. And obviously, we're in the midst of this COVID pandemic, and we've just been working all around the world on putting vaccines in place and this type of thing. But I really believe that in the context of the Biological Weapons Convention review conference, we should be thinking in imaginative ways about how to work with a number of countries in this space. But in my view, we should place an emphasis on working with the Russians in this space. They're obviously very good at vaccine production and this type of thing. So those are just three areas, but it was a part of the so-called non-nuclear cooperative threat reduction program to work on bio-related issues. So I think it perhaps should get a renewal. That said, now the Russians are insisting, and as part of a long time propaganda campaign, that laboratories and centers that the U.S. put in place under non-nuclear in countries like Georgia and so forth are actually, producing biological weapons, and it's complete nonsense. So I think we do have some political humps to get over to get into this kind of cooperation again. I hope we can do that.
Thank you, Rose. See, there was a question back here, and then I will call on the judges.
You just mentioned about the
You want to identify yourself?
Sorry, my name is Sanjana, and I'm from India. You mentioned about the possibility of having some kind of dialogue with India and Pakistan because they remain outside the purview of the NPT. And there are many other nuclear weapon possessing states which are outside the NPT. But now we see, they're like overlapping dyads. For instance, US and China are in a dyad, and India and China are in a dyad, and India is in a dyad, and Pakistan. There's an overlapping dyad, and bilateral dialogues may not work, so there's a need for a multilateral dialogue. But I see that there's a lot of challenges to bring all these countries together because there are different levels of, capability development. So how do you see the possibility of them bringing together? Is there an interest within the US to bring them together? And what could be the common grounds to, get them on the table?
I can't say there's any official interest. I want to be clear, I'm speaking today on behalf of myself and my own, I would say, informal ideas. But I will just recollect, and again, it's back to my remark earlier about compartmentalization, that you can't do everything. You can't solve all the problems at once. So you choose some problems and try to work on them. Indeed, and this is a precedent that I think is useful to refer to in this case, that in the period between 2012 and approximately 2014, we had something called the P5 Plus, which was the P5 nuclear weapon states under the NPT, plus India and Pakistan, to work on trying to break through the barriers to begin fissile material cutoff trade negotiations at the conference on China. And we had a number, I think, I wouldn't call them super productive discussions because I talked about that kabuki dance earlier. It was a little bit of a kabuki dance, especially having India and Pakistan kind of eyeing each other at the table, but then both of those countries rather, I wouldn't say concerned. They were glad to be at the table with the nuclear weapon states under the NPT, but not quite sure how to relate. Again, as have been long-standing, of course, issues between nuclear weapon states in the NPT setting and the South Asian countries possessing nuclear weapons. So it was, but I think they were good discussions, and I think it's a sound precedent to consider now as we think about what other problems we might tackle. And in the case of talking about missile proliferation around the Eurasian periphery, but also in the South Asian setting, I think it could make sense to get some group together, perhaps a P5 plus, perhaps it's only initially the United States and China, Russia, together with India and Pakistan. I don't know, I'm only speculating, but I'm saying we have some experience working together, and I think there's a shared interest in the threat that intermediate range ground launch systems pose, particularly the threat of short-running attack on critical command and control targets. That's always been a concern about them, that they could pose a decapitation threat. So I think I can see an interest there for both Delhi and for Islamabad. But the question and the trick is how to get everybody to agree that it's worth having a conversation about. I've had these conversations in the second track. So far, I have to admit, not too successful, but at least the issue has been raised and broached and discussed.
Hi, I'm Chase. I'm from Connecticut. So you talked about how the next big step should be finding a replacement for New Start, and that should be the biggest fish to fry. And I know a lot can change between now and when, New Start does expire, the extension. But will the next, will the follow-up to New Start be made out of desperation and necessity, or in good faith progress at this point, would you say?
Well, I don't think it'll be out of desperation by any means. I think the trickiest issue coming up is exactly how do we get the Chinese engaged in a proper discussion here. I'm not saying that I'm not like the previous administration that tried to shoehorn China into a New Start following. It doesn't make sense. They are still way, smaller in terms of their nuclear arsenal than the United States and Russia, and the possession of nuclear weapons as well. However, what they are doing is concerning, so we need to somehow get them into the conversation and start to understand their goals, how they are thinking about strategic stability. Are they backing away from their traditional approach to nuclear doctrine, which is to depend on second strike retaliation as the fundamental basis for their nuclear deterrence policy? These are all questions we need to talk to the Chinese about, but perhaps I'm being overly simplistic about it, but I see a kind of direct line between the New Start treaty and the replacement for New Start. I hope that we will, and I should be clear about this, I hope despite the debates in Washington that we will see some further reductions. I hope that we will get those direct limits on warheads that I was talking about, and not only non-strategic, but all nuclear warheads. And that furthermore, we will continue to limit delivery vehicles and deploy the non-deployed launchers. So I see that the structure of New Start is suitable to modernize and use in the next treaty, but the but is related to how to get Chinese engagement, and that's the all-important question.
Well, I promise that Chase was not a plant in the audience, but I do think that he brought our conversation to probably a perfect close with New Start again at the top of mind. So, Rose, I want to thank you so much for such a tremendous conversation. Thank you for spending the time with us, and please join me in thanking our guests.